All right, hey everybody. Since I am gone, we need to get some of these notes taken care of. I figured the best way for that to get done is for me to kind of walk you through these as you take them. We're going to be looking at the Civil War and what's going on and some of the major battles and players involved with the Civil War. Before we get started, you should be able to pause and start playing and rewind and all that kind of stuff. Um, on your screen as you're watching this. So as I'm done talking through each slide, if you're not done typing and or writing out what's going on or what I'm saying or what's on the screen, pause and you can still view the screen. Second of all, as we're going through, remember you don't have to write word for word what I say. Summarize what I say, shorten it down, make it fit to your words, whatever works best for you. If you want to write it down word for word, that's fine as well. Just make sure you know what you're writing down so that when you go back and you look at these notes before your test here in the next couple of weeks, you know what's going on. As with anything, any assignment that's going on while I'm gone here, if you have questions, email me, all right, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Or you can also just jot them down on this Google Doc or whatnot for me to answer when I come back. So at this point, I'm going to start the PowerPoint. I'm going to start going through the slides. Remember, if I get going too fast, you can always pause it and go back and rewind and hear what I have to say again. All right, so we're going to be looking at the Civil War, the Union, the Northern states versus the Confederate states from the Confederate States of America, located in the southern part of our country. All right. And the Civil War started in April of 1861 and ended in May of 1865, so 4.5 long years. It was fought between the Union Army, so the Union Army came from states in the North, along with the Confederate Army from the Confederate States of America, which are located in the South. If you look over at the map on the lower right-hand corner, the Union states are the states in blue. So California, Oregon, Kansas, and then north and east from there. Border states are in the greenish color, and then the southern states are in the gray, stretching from Texas to Virginia down to Florida and whatnot. Talking about secession, vocabulary word, a word you should know by now, to be honest with you. Secession, that's to leave the Union. South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union in December of 1860. And they were first to leave, followed quickly by the 10 other southern states from Texas, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. They all left by the middle to latter part of March in 1861. So the Civil War, the deadliest, the bloodiest war that we have fought up until this point, even today, considering the fact that every time someone was shot and or killed, they were Americans. All right, I'm going to head to the next slide. So if you need to continue or finish writing something down, pause it at this time. So we're looking at the reasons for the Civil War. Lots of different reasons for the Civil War, but here are two key topics, two main ideas, two of the main causes for the Civil War. All right. The first one being is the idea of slavery. The Confederate States strongly believed in slavery. All right. It's something that was kind of like in their DNA, something that in the South they had always known for their entire lives. And really they didn't know how things would continue on if they were to lose slavery. Okay. With slavery, they thought each state should be able to make their own decision when it comes to whether slavery should be allowed or not. They didn't think it was something that was a federal government issue. It was more of a states' rights issue. So while the Confederate southern states were in support of slavery, the North, they had a moral objection to slavery. They thought it was needed and necessary to stop slavery from continuing on, just like the northern states had in the years prior to the Civil War. Slavery was outlawed decades before the Civil War, but yet slavery still remained in the South. So many people in the North thought that it was their duty, I guess you could say, to try and end slavery throughout the entire country. Second big reason for the Civil War, states' rights. Southern states thought really from the time of the Revolution, from Hamilton versus Jefferson, all of those guys, that the federal government's power should be relatively limited, and that many of the decisions that should be made at the state's level, at the state level, and that each state should be able to make up their own mind, make up their own decision. If what's best for one state isn't good for another, they should be able to figure that out and not have just a blanket statement made by the federal government. The northern states, however, they were generally in favor of more federal centralized government. All right, they were okay with the idea of the federal government making laws that encompassed all of them. They were okay with the idea that someone in Washington, D.C., who may not even have ever been to their state, making decisions. The South was completely against this. They wanted the states at each in each region to be able to make their own. So what's good in Michigan may not be good for Tennessee, and so they can each make up their own mind. Again, I'm going to go to the next slide at this point. If you need to continue with anything here, go ahead and pause it at this time. So Fort Sumter. The fort's located in Charleston Harbor down in South Carolina. And this was really kind of the place of the first shots of the Civil War. All right, you can see a picture up here in the upper right-hand corner. That's what Fort Sumter looks like now. And what all transpired is that was a Union military base in the middle of Charleston Harbor. And the Confederates said, "Get out. We're no longer a part of your country. Get out." And not only for Fort Sumter, but any other military establishment in the South, they said the Union Army needs to leave. This is no longer your base. This is no longer your country. Leave. Well, the Union was kind of trying to push their luck a little bit, and they refused to leave. And Lincoln and the higher-ups in the military continued to try and send resupply to the soldiers stationed on the base. Confederate Army essentially blockaded the fort, wouldn't allow supplies to come in, started an armed conflict, a short armed conflict, but then it also led to bigger things, all right? The Confederacy at that point, with the armed conflict going on and some shots being fired, so it started bombarding the fort. They had it essentially surrounded, and they were firing on it for a substantial period of time. The Union soldiers inside said, "There's nothing we can do here." They ended up surrendering to the Confederates, giving up the post in Charleston Harbor, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is considered the first shots in the beginning of the American Civil War. So Fort Sumter, Charleston, South Carolina. This, what looks essentially like walls at this point, about 140 years later or so, 160 years later. This is the place where the shots were first fired. All right, I'm going to go on the next slide. So if you need to pause for anything, do so now. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the First Battle of Manassas, took place just outside of Manassas, Virginia, in July of 1861. This was really kind of the first actively engaged battle by both sides. Okay, Civil War had been declared earlier, a couple months earlier. You had all the states that had seceded, the issue at Fort Sumter. Now, this was a kind of an agreed upon location for a battle, where you had the Union troops had organized. As you can look up on the upper right-hand corner of that map, you had the Union in the blue, all right, and then you had the Confederates in the red, and they had kind of dug in across Henry Hill there, and Chin Ridge, looks like maybe, and Bald Hill. And so you had the North and the blue kind of dug in, and this was absolute carnage, absolute something that was completely unexpected. the North and the South. This was after the. Sorry about that. Got cut off. Apparently, some sort of time limit, so we're just going to have to work with it here. But this battle caught everyone off guard. All right, the the Northern troops were there to fight along with the Confederate troops, but no one really knew what to expect. They thought it was going to be something that was a little bit more civilized and a little bit more low key, I guess, or not as deadly as what it turned out being. The Confederate Army kind of won this battle in a landslide, and it was a pretty bloody affair. Both sides realized when they walked away from this battlefield that this was not going to be a short little war. This was going to be something that was going to be long. It was going to be sustained, and it was something that people were very, very passionate about. Interesting part about the first Battle of Manassas or the Battle of Bull Run here is that the surrounding population, Manassas is not located far from Virginia, and the surrounding population actually came and went to watch the battle as if it was a reenactment. They were there, people sitting on hilltops enjoying a lunch, and watched everything unfold. And to many of those people, it was, holy smokes, this is the real deal. And led to some people really evaluating how the Civil War was really going to unfold. The Anaconda Plan we've talked about multiple times. Vocabulary word, by now we should know this, all right? This plan was put into place as a blockade to surround the Confederate States. Two main goals: to stop trade from the Confederate States to other foreign countries, and to use ships and haulers and transporters to move large amounts of troops all around the South. And it would transporting from the northern states down to any place located along the coastline, and then they could march inland from there. It was in a three-step process. The first step was the majority of the Atlantic coastline along with the Gulf of Mexico coastline. The second one was this. The second step was up the Mississippi River to try and cut off the Confederacy from some of its other states, and the third one is up into Chesapeake Bay, up into Maryland and Virginia. Anaconda Plan sounds like a good idea. It worked, like I said down here in the PowerPoint. Kinda, sort of, maybe, not great, but kind of good enough. Got the Union what they needed. Hard to patrol that long a coastline, but it worked fairly effectively for them. I'm going to move on to the next slide, so if you need anything from here, go ahead and pause it, and we'll move on. The siege at Vicksburg. This was, Vicksburg is in Mississippi. No, not the one by Kalamazoo in Michigan here, but it was in Mississippi. And the Union troops were led by General Ulysses S. Grant, and they were trying to take control of the Mississippi River so that they could send Union ships up and down at will, trading and continuing on with business from the north. All right. And so General Grant took his group of soldiers and they went and surrounded Vicksburg. Actually, it was a fairly easy way to surround them. Mississippi River's on the western border. On the northern and southern border was a very thick swampland, and on the eastern border, that's where Grant and his troops stationed. All right, this city was the last of the Confederates' major strongholds along the Mississippi River. We won that in the north, the Union. Then they were going to have control of the Mississippi River, and so Grant had to attack uphill to get to Vicksburg, so giving the Confederates quite a bit of advantage. And he failed. Many of his men were injured or killed, and they were not able to take the city. So instead of giving up or continuing to attack, Grant said, hey, we're just going to dig in and we'll wait them out. And that's what they did. They dug trenches and did not allow anything or anyone to come and go from the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, starting in May of 1863. By July 4th, the Confederates gave up. They surrendered. By that point, their food was gone. They had very little, if any, clean water. People were dying of starvation. Disease was rampant. There were people resorting to eating the leather from their shoes. They were that hungry. And so the Confederate general finally said, "We can't win this. We're done." All right. And you got to remember, it wasn't just the Confederate soldiers that suffered here. Vicksburg, Mississippi is a fairly decent sized town at this point, and the civilians trapped inside the community, they were having probably the roughest go out of all of it. They were starving to death regularly. Their crops stolen by the Confederate troops, and because they needed the quote unquote energy to fight the Union Yankees, and so these people were dying of starvation at much more rapid pace, and just simply spreading disease amongst each other quite rapidly as well. Gettysburg. Map, lower right hand corner, I want to address that first. Gettysburg, if you look, is in eastern central Pennsylvania, near the border of Maryland. And this was the farthest north that General Lee or any really Confederate armies or generals had gotten. All right. And this took place in the summer of July of 63, July 1st through the 3rd. And Lee and the Confederate armies were trying to continue their march forward. They were essentially trying to split the Union in two, get farther north, and really start to scare the people of the North and the Union about what was going on. Because at this point, most of the war had been fought in the South. And so by bringing the war to the North, they were hoping that they would intimidate some folks and get them to call on ending the war and letting, which the South was winning at that time, and having the Union say, all right, Confederacy, we're going to let you do your thing. But that was not to be the case. The Union Army kind of rallied up and got their armies into place and hunkered down, and ended up, after 3 long, hot, brutal, deadly, bloody days, defeating the Confederacy. It was the farthest north they'd ever gotten, and it was the farthest they were ever going to get. They never threatened the North again at this point. They were looking to get into Philadelphia, New York City, places like that where people would it would cause a panic. All right. Gettysburg and the siege at Vicksburg, those were the turning points. Up until then, the Union was clearly losing. They were not being efficient, and they were not winning the battles that they needed to sustain what was going on. They won 2 major battles. One, along the Mississippi with the siege of Vicksburg. 2, they were able to prevent Lee's and the Confederate armies push north, and stopped any momentum that the Confederacy had. And that was huge. It truly was huge, and really set the ball going forward for the Union in a positive direction. The Emancipation Proclamation, executive order issued by Lincoln, January 1st, 1863 is when it went into effect. Did it actually free the slaves? We've talked about this in class. No, it didn't. It took some time. It took the Union Army to expand down and to move down into slave territory in the Confederacy, and then they would have to personally free the slaves. It wasn't just a signature on a piece of paper. It took time. All right. The Confederates viewed it as, hey, this is the reason why right here that we're rebelling. This is the federal government overstretching their rights and making laws that impact us at a state level that should be left for us. All right. Slaves behind Union lines were freed. All right. So if you were a slave and the Union had already controlled the area in which you lived, you're all good. You were able to be free. But it also took slaves farther in the deep South, having to wait for that Union Army to get to them. And unfortunately, in some places, they never got to them, and they had to wait till the end of the war to actually be set free. But the Emancipation Proclamation, the big thing is, did it free the slaves? Some, yes, but not all of them, and definitely not immediately. All right, I'm going to pause, or I'm going to continue on. If you need to pause to go to the next slide, or before I go to the next slide, why don't you do that? All right, so now we're going to talk about General William T. Sherman. General Sherman is famous for total war. We've talked about that as being a vocabulary word where all rules are off, everything's destroyed, and whoever is participating in that total war does whatever they feel is necessary to make sure that their side can be successful. All right, well, Sherman started his path through the state of Georgia in December of 1864, and his path went from the Tennessee border through the city of Atlanta, burning the city of Atlanta down all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Along the way, he destroyed everything: buildings, houses, burning them to the ground, killing livestock, burning crops, whatever he could do to inflict as much damage on the Confederacy, he did. He tore up rail lines. He anything that was going on that could be destroyed that was going to benefit the Confederacy, he did. All right. Anything from military targets, industrial, civilian properties, he just went after it all. And he burned literally the city of Atlanta down, one of the largest cities in the Confederacy, put flame to it. The houses were close enough. He torched it all. And so it was a 6-day trip from the Tennessee Georgia line to the Atlantic Ocean, and along the way they just wreaked havoc. And it was a prime example of total war by William Sherman, General of the Union Army. I'm gonna head to the next slide. If you need a moment, pause it, and you can start it up when you're ready. So, momentum of the war. Momentum started one way and swung heavily back in favor of the Union about midway through the war. During the first 2 years, the Confederacy, they were winning. They were viewed as having better generals, more prepared, more ready, and willing to do what's needed to do to win. All right. They were aggressive, they were on the attack, and they did everything they could to try and win that war. The downside: the Battle of Gettysburg and the siege at Vicksburg. Both of those happened in 1863, in the summer of 1863, and they served as the turning point. Victory at Gettysburg gave the Union a boost, prevented Lee's army from advancing any farther north and menacing the cities like Philadelphia and New York. All right, not so that once they got that momentum on their side, they used their other advantages and started to dominate. Numbers and size of how many people they had in their military, their equipment, all of the infrastructure things that they had to their advantage, they slowly started improving upon those. And with the momentum, it really increased, and they started controlling the way to victory. I'm going to go to the next slide. Again, pause if you need to get some of this before you move on. Appomattox Courthouse. This on the top picture here. This is a actual picture of what the courthouse looks like today out in Western Virginia. On the bottom, you see Robert E. Lee on the left with the white beard signing the surrender papers to Ulysses S. Grant, who's sitting in the chair on the right. And this is where the Civil War officially came to an end. General Lee and the Confederate armies of Northern Virginia surrendered to General Grant and the Union Army in 1865. Grant and other Union generals had essentially cut off Lee's route of escape, leaving him no option but to surrender or fight to potentially his death. Grant and the Union armies treated Lee, who was well respected in the Union Army, with dignity, respect, did not harass, intimidate, showboat, or in any ways Lee. He allowed them to surrender and turn in their weapons. They were able to save certain things like swords as mementos and whatnot. But the Appomattox Courthouse, that is in Western Virginia, is where the Civil War ended, April of 1865. I'm going to move on. If you need to pause, do so at this time. All right, the end of the war. Lee surrendered in April of 1865, but that didn't end the war. You have to understand, it's not like today where you can just pick up a radio or a cell phone and say, hey, it's over with, we're done. It took time for the message to get to the Union and Confederate forces, especially places like down in the deep South or out far west, in the far west, all right? Once the surrender was complete and other generals realized the Confederates were not going to win, they surrendered relatively quickly. But if, it's amazing that it took over a month. If you remember, he surrendered on, I believe, on April 9th. The last battle was fought in May 12th and 13th, over a month after the surrender, way out in Texas, in West Texas. So it takes a while for word to spread. But just imagine that guys were being shot and killed at, even though, or shot at and killed, even though um, the war was already over with. All right, so got to remember that the word did not travel as quickly back then. Pause if you need it, otherwise, I'm going to move on. Last slide here, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was shot and killed April 15th, 1865, within a week of the the end of the Civil War. Shot at Ford's Theater, which is in Washington, D.C., not far from the White House, by John Wilkes Booth. If you look at this picture on the right, John Wilkes Booth is in the right-hand side with the mustache with the little puff coming out of the end of the gun. John Wilkes Booth managed to escape for 11 days with a broken leg and was eventually shot and killed I believe he escaped down into southern Virginia at that point. Booth shot and killed Lincoln because of Lincoln's willingness to accept former slaves into America and just willingness to integrate these former slaves. And Booth didn't think that was correct. He thought that still that racist mindset of they're slaves for a reason, they're inferior, they're not as good as us. And Lincoln was just the opposite. Welcomed the slaves in, wanted them to be a part of what was going on in America. And so those discrepancies, John Wilkes Booth actually had a group that they were all supposed to carry out certain assassinations that night of like the top 4 or 5 administrators within the Lincoln administration. But Booth was the only one that actually really carried out his attempt and assassinated his individual. If there's anything we talked about in here that you need clarification on, please email me, highlight it, mark a note, whatever it is. When I get back, I can talk about it, or if you email me, I'll get back to you here in the next couple of days. Otherwise, have a good rest of the time when I'm gone. Take it easy, behave, and I'll talk to you here in a couple of days when I'm back. Bye.